By 2011, the national spotlight on Eddie Long had begun to shift from allegations themselves to the outcomes of the lawsuits and the broader impact on his ministry. The media storm had faded slightly, but the consequences of the accusations continued to ripple through his church, the public, and the conversation around religious leadership. What had begun as whispers inside a sanctuary had transformed into a profound reckoning for Eddie Long and those around him. The legal process was intense and closely monitored. Reports from civil court filings indicated that the plaintiffs and Eddie Long's legal team were negotiating a resolution. Out-of-court settlements became a focal point of speculation. While details of the settlement were kept private, the very fact that it occurred fueled additional debate. To some, the settlement suggested acknowledgement of wrongdoing. To others, it was a pragmatic decision to avoid prolonged litigation and further public scrutiny. During this period, Eddie Long maintained a consistent public message. He denied all allegations and emphasized his continued commitment to God and his ministry. He continued preaching to his congregation, often emphasizing themes of forgiveness, endurance, and faith under trial. His sermons and public appearances were closely watched by the media, who frequently interpreted even minor comments as significant. For Long, these appearances were both an act of defiance and a strategy to reassure his supporters that he remained steadfast despite the controversy. Inside New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, the effects of the allegations and subsequent media attention were tangible. Congregants were divided, some loyal to Long to the very end, others quietly disillusioned. Attendance and participation fluctuated. Long's leadership style, once celebrated for its charisma and authority, now faced scrutiny not just externally, but internally. Staff meetings and private conversations reportedly reflected uncertainty and concern about the future of the ministry. The media continued to play a major role, analyzing the implications of the settlement and reporting on public reactions. News outlets debated whether the resolution brought closure or whether questions would continue to linger indefinitely. Talk shows and online platforms dissected what the settlement might mean for the credibility of megachurch leaders and the oversight of religious institutions more broadly. It became clear that the Eddie Long controversy had transcended any single person. It had become a reference point for discussions about accountability, trust, and power within religious organizations. The broader public reaction mirrored this complexity. Some members of the African American faith community rallied in Long's defense, emphasizing his contributions to education, mentorship programs, and community leadership. They argued that the lawsuits and media coverage were part of a larger pattern of attacks on influential Black leaders. Others saw the controversy as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the importance of transparency and accountability when one individual holds tremendous influence over others, particularly vulnerable youth. Even as the legal battles concluded, the personal and spiritual consequences persisted. Eddie Long himself reportedly experienced significant stress, public scrutiny, and challenges in maintaining personal relationships and church operations. The incident raised broader questions about the pressures placed on religious leaders and the potential consequences when personal failings or alleged misconduct collide with public expectations. These questions resonated with both clergy and congregants across the country, sparking conversations about ethical leadership, accountability mechanisms, and the responsibilities of faith communities. Over time, the focus slowly shifted from daily media coverage to reflection and analysis. Documentaries, articles, and retrospectives examined the rise and fall of Eddie Long's public reputation. Journalists and commentators explored how allegations and media coverage interact to shape public perception and how communities respond when leaders face serious accusations. The case became an example of the complex intersection between faith, media scrutiny, and the public's demand for accountability. Eddie Long's life after the lawsuits continued to reflect both resilience and controversy. He remained active in his ministry, yet the shadow of the allegations lingered. Public discussions of his career almost always included mention of the legal claims, highlighting the enduring impact of the controversy on his legacy. His story illustrates the long-term consequences of allegations, regardless of legal outcomes, and how they can redefine a public figure's narrative permanently. In 2017, Eddie Long passed away from cancer, a moment that prompted both mourning and reflection across the nation. For supporters, it was a reminder of his contributions to faith and community. For critics, it was an opportunity to assess the lessons from his life and ministry. Across both perspectives, the controversy surrounding his lawsuits and the intense media scrutiny remained a defining element of his public legacy. The Eddie Long case left behind several enduring lessons for the broader society. It highlighted the immense power and influence wielded by religious leaders, the vulnerabilities of congregants and youth within faith communities, and the role of media in shaping public discourse. The lawsuits, the settlement, and the national attention created a conversation about trust, accountability, and the consequences of unchecked authority, conversations that continue to resonate today. Ultimately, the story of Eddie Long is a complex one. He was a man of extraordinary influence, a spiritual leader with the ability to inspire thousands, and a figure whose life was deeply intertwined with both devotion and controversy. The allegations and media storm revealed the tension between public perception and private conduct, between faith and accountability, and between charisma and scrutiny. His story reminds us that public figures, especially those in positions of moral authority, are subject not only to legal standards, but to the relentless judgment of a society that watches, questions, and remembers. The storm surrounding Eddie Long may have settled, but its shadow remains. For his supporters, it is a story of loyalty and forgiveness. For critics, it is a cautionary tale of the dangers of power and influence without transparency. And for the wider public, it serves as a powerful reminder that faith, leadership, and morality are always under the watchful eyes of both followers and society at large. By the time the allegations against Bishop Eddie Long reached national headlines, the story had already begun to take on a life of its own. What started as lawsuits filed by a few former mentees had quickly transformed into a media frenzy, with news outlets, talk shows, blogs, and social media fueling public debate. The media storm would not only shape how the public viewed Long, but also highlight broader questions about power, accountability, and the role of the press in reporting on religious figures. The scale of coverage was unprecedented for a megachurch scandal. Major networks ran daily segments analyzing the lawsuits. Cable news anchors debated the implications of the allegations. Morning shows featured interviews with legal experts, religious commentators, and former church members. Headlines questioned not only the legal aspects of the case, but also Eddie Long's personal character, leadership style, and past sermons. Every statement he made, every gesture on the pulpit was dissected for meaning. Television cameras appeared at the gates of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church day after day. Reporters interviewed parishioners, capturing raw reactions from a community divided. Some church members insisted that Long was being falsely accused, framing the story as an attack on a powerful black pastor who had uplifted his community. Others expressed concern, quietly questioning the gap between the pastor's public message and the allegations now dominating headlines. Print media, online platforms, and blogs added another layer to the storm. Investigative reporters examined Long's finances, highlighting the wealth and luxury associated with his ministry. Images of his designer suits, expensive cars, and opulent lifestyle circulated widely. Analysts debated whether such displays of wealth were consistent with the spiritual values he preached. To critics, these images suggested hypocrisy. To supporters, they were symbols of success and hard work. Talk shows amplified the controversy, often framing the story as more than just a legal matter. Hosts debated issues of morality, influence, and the responsibility of clergy. Questions about how churches monitor the behavior of leaders became central to the conversation. Viewers at home were introduced to complex discussions about power dynamics, youth mentorship programs, and the potential for abuse within institutions designed to inspire faith and trust. Social media added a rapid-fire dimension to the media storm. Twitter threads, Facebook posts, and online forums allowed people to voice opinions instantly. Hashtags and trending topics ensured that Eddie Long's name remained in public discourse. Memes, commentary, and news links spread the story to audiences who might never have followed traditional news coverage. The speed and reach of digital media made it nearly impossible to control the narrative. Eddie Long and his team responded strategically, carefully balancing denial with the need to maintain public appearances. He continued preaching every Sunday, framing the allegations as attacks on his reputation, faith, and mission. Press statements emphasized his innocence, but the media often interpreted silence or careful phrasing as evasiveness. Every interview was scrutinized for nuance, tone, and subtext. Even minor gestures or offhand comments became fodder for news cycles. The media storm also fueled internal debates within the church. Leaders and staff reportedly held private meetings to discuss how to manage the growing public scrutiny. Some argued that Long should step back temporarily to protect the church, while others insisted that his continued presence was necessary to maintain unity. Congregants were divided, with some defending the pastor fiercely and others quietly distancing themselves. Attendance numbers fluctuated, reflecting the tension between faith and doubt. Beyond the church, the media coverage sparked a national conversation about the broader implications of the case. Commentators discussed the influence of megachurches in society, the challenges of holding religious leaders accountable, and the intersection of race, religion, and public perception. The story became a lens through which Americans debated trust, morality, and institutional oversight. It raised questions that went far beyond Eddie Long himself, challenging viewers to consider how society responds when leaders in positions of power face serious allegations. Legal experts featured prominently in the coverage, breaking down the lawsuits and their possible outcomes. Analysts explained how civil cases differ from criminal investigations, what evidence would be necessary, and how settlements could affect both the plaintiffs and the defendant. Every filing and court hearing was reported in detail, adding layers of complexity to the story. To the public, these legal discussions underscored the gravity of the situation and reinforced the sense that the allegations were far from trivial. Media coverage also highlighted the contradictions between Long's sermons and the allegations. Clips of fiery preaching about moral purity were juxtaposed with news reports describing the claims against him. The contrast created a narrative of tension between image and reality, between public persona and private actions. For some viewers, this reinforced a perception of hypocrisy. For others, it intensified their loyalty, believing that powerful men are often targeted unfairly. By mid-2011, the media storm had reached its peak. Every public appearance, press release, or sermon became news. Analysts debated the influence of public opinion on legal proceedings. Bloggers speculated on the personal lives of those involved. Social media amplified rumors and commentary. The sheer volume of attention made it impossible for the story to fade, and the controversy remained in public consciousness for months. Amidst the coverage, the human element remained central. Church members, plaintiffs, staff, and even Long himself were all affected by the relentless scrutiny. Families and friends of the parties involved felt the pressure. Emotional reactions, confusion, and fear permeated the community. The media often highlighted these personal dimensions, showing how allegations could ripple through networks of relationships and affect thousands of people. The storm also raised questions about how religious institutions respond when allegations surface. Congregations, denominational organizations, and community leaders were all forced to reckon with the tension between loyalty and accountability. The story of Eddie Long became a case study in how power and influence can both inspire devotion and create vulnerability. It was a cautionary tale about the consequences of public trust and the responsibilities of leadership. Through all of this, Eddie Long maintained a public posture of faith and defiance. He continued his ministry while the lawsuits proceeded, and he publicly denied wrongdoing. His narrative focused on his innocence and his commitment to God, framing the allegations as distractions from his mission. For supporters, this was a rallying point, a reason to stand by him. For critics, it was further evidence of the dissonance between his public persona and the claims against him. Ultimately, the media storm surrounding Eddie Long transformed a local scandal into a national spectacle. It exposed the power of journalism, television, and social media to shape public perception. It revealed the vulnerability of institutions when leaders face allegations of misconduct. and it created a dialogue about morality, authority, and accountability that resonated far beyond the walls of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church. The coverage left a lasting mark on both Eddie Long's ministry and the broader conversation about religious leadership. It demonstrated the speed with which allegations can become public crises and highlighted the pressures faced by individuals, congregations, and communities caught in the middle. By the end of this chapter, it was clear. The media storm had become one of the defining elements of the Eddie Long controversy, a relentless force that shaped opinions, influenced narratives, and ensured that the story would not be forgotten. By late 2010, the whispers had transformed into headlines, and the allegations against Bishop Eddie Long had taken center stage in national news. The 4 lawsuits filed by young men who had once been part of Long's mentorship program sparked a storm that drew attention not just from the church community, but from the country at large. Questions of power, influence, and accountability now overshadowed the very ministry that had built Long's reputation. The lawsuits made clear that the young men were claiming that the pastor had used his authority over them in ways they described as coercive and manipulative. For many, the fact that the accusations came from young men who had previously trusted Long added a layer of shock and betrayal. It wasn't just about allegations of misconduct. It was about trust broken at its most fundamental level. News of the lawsuits spread quickly. Local newspapers covered the story first, but soon national outlets began running features and investigative reports. Television anchors summarized the allegations on evening news programs. Headlines questioned the nature of Long's ministry, the relationship between clergy and youth members, and the broader role of megachurch pastors in society. The combination of faith, power, and alleged misconduct made the story irresistible to the public, and the media frenzy intensified by the day. Public reactions were immediate and divided. Some people rallied to Eddie Long's side, insisting that the claims were politically or racially motivated attempts to tarnish the reputation of a prominent black pastor. They cited his long history of community service, mentorship programs, and charitable work as evidence of his integrity. Prayer vigils were held outside New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, and many congregants publicly voiced their support, often pointing to their personal experiences with Long as proof of his genuine influence. Others, however, were skeptical. National commentators, journalists, and advocacy groups began questioning the lack of transparency surrounding Long's ministry. The media noted contradictions between his public sermons and the allegations now emerging. His emphasis on morality, discipline, and condemnation of same-sex relationships became a central point of discussion. Critics argued that these teachings created a complex backdrop, and they speculated about the consequences of unchecked authority in megachurches, especially when young people were involved. The lawsuits themselves detailed serious claims, and the legal process became a focus of intense coverage. Court filings, motions, and press releases were dissected by journalists. Legal analysts debated the possible outcomes, and commentators questioned how a high-profile pastor could navigate both public scrutiny and legal pressure. Each new filing seemed to amplify the controversy, as questions about influence, intimidation, and power dynamics were raised in every media cycle. As the story gained traction, the church itself struggled with the fallout. Attendance began to fluctuate. Church members were torn between loyalty to their pastor and their own moral compass. Internal meetings and private discussions became tense. Staff and leaders within the church were reportedly divided, some advising Long to step back temporarily, others urging him to maintain his position while fighting the allegations. The internal tension mirrored the national conversation, highlighting the challenge of reconciling faith with the legal and ethical implications of the claims. The media played a key role in shaping public perception. Talk shows, online news platforms, and cable networks debated the allegations for weeks on end. Long's personal lifestyle, including his wealth and public persona, was examined alongside the legal claims. The media narrative often focused not only on the lawsuits themselves, but also on what they symbolized: the vulnerability of congregations, the potential for abuse of power, and the difficulty of holding influential figures accountable in religious institutions. Eddie Long's response became a defining element of the story. In public statements and interviews, he denied the allegations and emphasized his innocence. He framed the lawsuits as attacks designed to harm his reputation, and he stressed his commitment to his faith and ministry. For some, this message resonated. It reinforced their belief in Long's character and spiritual authority. For others, it seemed evasive or defensive, raising further questions about what was being hidden and how accountability would be established. Despite the controversy, Long continued to preach, meet with congregants, and lead services. His appearances were often tense, filled with an undercurrent of scrutiny. Media crews recorded every sermon, every public event, and even casual interactions. The juxtaposition of his pastoral authority and the allegations created a complex image. A man who inspired devotion and admiration, yet simultaneously faced serious public doubt. The national conversation also reflected larger social and cultural themes. Commentators explored the role of race, religion, and social expectations in shaping both the narrative and public reactions. Questions arose about how Black megachurch leaders are perceived, how their influence intersects with community expectations, and how allegations of misconduct affect both individuals and institutions. This broader context added layers to the story, making it more than a simple legal dispute. It became a cultural moment, a reflection of trust, authority, and moral scrutiny in modern American society. Legal experts highlighted the unique challenges of the case. The lawsuits involved claims that were difficult to prove without first-hand testimony and evidence. At the same time, the mere filing of the lawsuits carried significant weight in the court of public opinion. The press coverage amplified this effect, turning the story into a narrative that extended far beyond the courthouse. Every news cycle reinforced the sense that the scandal was not just local, but national, impacting the image of megachurches, clergy, and faith leadership across the country. By the end of the first few months, the allegations had fundamentally altered Eddie Long's public persona. Where he had once been celebrated as a model of leadership, discipline, and spiritual guidance, he now faced scrutiny, doubt, and intense debate. Some of his supporters doubled down, while others quietly questioned their faith in his leadership. The dichotomy between the admiration of his followers and the skepticism of the public became one of the most compelling elements of the story, keeping it in the news and on the minds of millions. The emergence of the accusations also sparked conversations about accountability within religious institutions. How should churches handle allegations against leaders? What role should congregants, legal authorities, and the media play in ensuring justice? These questions became central to the national debate, turning Eddie Long's case into a reference point for discussions about power, morality, and the responsibilities of faith leaders. Through it all, Eddie Long maintained his public persona. He preached, he led, and he denied wrongdoing. Yet the storm continued to grow. Each new headline, each news segment, and each public discussion added momentum to the controversy. By the end of 2010, it was clear that the allegations had permanently changed the trajectory of Long's ministry and public image. What began as whispers inside a church had exploded into a nationwide conversation, one that would dominate headlines, courtrooms, and living rooms for months to come. The accusations emerged was not just about legal filings or news stories. It was about power and trust, about faith and doubt, about the tension between public image and private reality. For Eddie Long, the allegations would define the next chapter of his life. For his supporters and critics alike, they provided a lens through which to examine leadership, morality, and accountability in the modern religious world. And for the media, it was a story that could not be ignored. A perfect storm of influence, scandal, and the very human struggle to reconcile what we hope with what we know. It started with whispers, quiet ones, soft enough to be ignored at first. But those whispers would soon echo through churches, newsrooms, and television screens all across America. They were about Bishop Eddie Long, one of the most famous pastors in the country, a man whose powerful sermons and million-dollar ministry had made him a household name in the world of faith and prosperity. For years, Eddie Long was celebrated as a symbol of success and discipline. His words carried weight. His image was sharp, elegant suits, bold confidence, and the voice of authority. Every Sunday, thousands filled the massive sanctuary of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia. Cameras rolled as he spoke about family, purity, and the strength of faith. Politicians attended his services, and celebrities offered donations. New Birth wasn't just a church. It was a movement. But under the surface, away from the pulpit and the spotlight, small rumors began to stir. Church staff sometimes whispered about things that didn't add up. Late-night calls, private trips, and gifts given to young members of his mentorship program. Nothing certain, nothing proven. Just stories that floated quietly through the congregation. In early 2010, a few online blogs picked up on these whispers. They suggested that something troubling was hidden behind the public image of the preacher. At first, most people dismissed it. How could such claims be true about a man who had built a ministry on moral authority? Yet, as the internet began to grow louder, more questions appeared. Journalists started asking for comments. By the time Long's team realized how quickly the story was spreading, it had already escaped their control. Then came the moment that changed everything. In September 2010, 4 young men, all of them former members of Long's youth leadership program, filed lawsuits against him. They claimed he had used his position, power, and influence to manipulate them emotionally and personally. The shock was immediate. This wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a legal battle involving one of the most influential pastors in America. Each of these young men had once looked up to Eddie Long as a father figure. They had been part of his Longfellows Youth Academy, a mentorship program designed to guide young men towards strong moral character. Now they stood on the other side, accusing their mentor of betrayal. Within days, national media seized the story. CNN, ABC, and the New York Times carried the headlines. Cameras crowded the entrance to New Birth Missionary Baptist Church. Reporters waited at the gates for a comment. Inside the church, confusion and disbelief filled the air. Some members refused to believe a word of it. Others quietly wondered if the whispers had been true all along. That Sunday, the church was packed beyond capacity. Everyone came to hear what their pastor would say. When Eddie Long finally appeared on stage, the room fell silent. He looked calm but tense, gripping the pulpit with both hands. Then, in a steady voice, he spoke. "I am not a perfect man," he said, "but I am not the man being portrayed on television." It was a short statement, a denial but not a detailed defense. He promised to fight the accusations in court, not in the media. He talked about faith, about spiritual battles, about how the righteous are often tested by lies. His congregation stood and applauded, tears streaming down many faces. For them, this was an attack on their leader, and they intended to stand by him. Outside the church walls, however, the reaction was different. Television commentators analyzed every sentence of his speech. Talk show hosts debated the meaning of his words. Reporters dug into his past sermons, his financial records, and his luxurious lifestyle. Photos of his expensive suits and cars began circulating online. To critics, it was the picture of hypocrisy, a man who condemned immorality while living in excess. As days passed, the media pressure grew stronger. The story became more than just about one pastor. It became a national conversation about power, faith, and the dangers of unchecked authority within megachurches. Every detail was magnified, every silence interpreted, and yet, Eddie Long continued to preach each Sunday as if nothing had changed. Inside New Birth, the congregation began to split. Some members said the entire thing was a conspiracy, a calculated attempt to bring down a successful black church leader. They argued that the media had always been eager to destroy powerful men of faith. Others, however, couldn't ignore the uneasy questions. Attendance began to drop. Donations slowed. A quiet tension filled the sanctuary during every sermon. Eddie Long remained defiant. In his public statements, he repeated that he was innocent, and that the truth would eventually clear his name. His lawyers prepared for a long battle. His supporters held prayer vigils. His critics called for transparency. Through it all, the cameras never left his doorstep. What made the scandal even more explosive was the contradiction between Eddie Long's public image and the allegations against him. He had been one of the loudest voices preaching against homosexuality and moral weakness. His sermons were filled with fiery condemnations of what he called sexual sins. Now, those same sermons were being replayed on TV as reporters questioned whether the preacher's crusade against sin had been a cover for something else entirely. For the public, it became a story of hypocrisy and downfall. For the church members, it was heartbreak and confusion. And for Eddie Long himself, it was the fight of his life, a battle not only in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. By the end of 2010, the lawsuits had become a full-blown national scandal. The details were debated on every news channel, every blog, and every talk show. The man once admired for his confidence and charisma was now a target of relentless scrutiny. Yet even in the middle of this chaos, he refused to step down from his pulpit. The storm had only just begun. What started as a few quiet whispers had now become a roar that couldn't be silenced. The church that once symbolized hope and strength was now under siege by questions of truth, loyalty, and faith. Eddie Long stood firm, promising his congregation that justice and God would vindicate him. But the world outside wasn't so sure. The lawsuits were moving forward. The media wouldn't let go. And for millions watching at home, this story had become a test of belief, not just in one man, but in the institutions people had trusted for decades. The stage was set for what would become one of the most intense media storms the modern church had ever seen.